Hello, everybody. This is our last lecture in social culture and anthropology. Um, please remember that if you are watching this lecture, you need to have already watched the gender neutral YouTube video. Um, and yeah, okay. So real quickly, the reflection is due at the end of this week. Also uh the midterm will be due at the end of next week. Okay, so keep that in mind. Yeah. Yeah, oh sorry. Reflection 3 is gonna be due at the end of this week. And then with the quiz is also gonna be due at the end of this week. All right. Midterm exam will have 20 questions multiple choice, 4 questions short answer, and 90 minutes in one attempt. Please use the study guide, look for the answers in the PowerPoint. I'll be posting a review on the 13th. Okay. All right, cool. So, you've already watched this video with Mappa and their family. So what is something that you believe is natural of one sex and something that you believe is social culture of one sex? So before we get started, I also want to illustrate that there's a big difference between sex and gender. This is too late. So sex is the biological definition of male and female, and gender is the cultural assignment of being a man or a woman, right? So what is something that's natural of one sex, something that's cultural of one sex, right? So, for natural, I hear in my classes, again, this is difficult because we aren't live, but I hear body parts are the biggest ones, right? The reproductive organs, for women, sometimes their hips are bigger or like wider. Upper body strength is not as much as males. Adam's apple, right? These are like kind of the biological things that are different between men or between males and females. Now, what is something that is cultural that's different between men and women? There are endless ones, right? It's just superficially like our hair, the way we dress, what is appropriate in terms of I don't know, wearing pants versus a dress. Um, what is appropriate to say sometimes, less so now, but it is different when, for example, a woman or a girl curses and a guy or a boy curses, that is interpreted differently. There's a lot of differences in what people will consider seriously for certain types of jobs. There's differences in terms of what is expected of girls and boys and men and women, right? There's a million different differences, right? And those are all cultural, okay? But again, like the most obvious ones are the things that are superficial, right? The way you do your hair, the way the clothes you wear, the bathroom you use. These are all things that are culturally assigned to being of a man or of a woman. Okay. Now, so you've already watched this video. If you need the link again, it's in here. But your first impression opinions. Do you agree with the choice the mom has made with their family? Why or why not? What challenges do you think they will face in the future? What are these challenges rooted in? And is this wrong? Okay, so I play this video. I played both these videos, this video and the Korean adoptee one, because I try to make it relevant to things that are going on today and topics that are interesting today. Now, I'm not gonna lie to you, a lot of students have a pretty powerful impression of this video, right? And is understandable. A lot of the students might not agree with the way that Mapa and Mama raised their kids, right? But the question and the reason why I show you this question, this video in general, is to ask yourself why. What is different, right? Why do you not like? What makes you feel uncomfortable about this? And of course, me personally, even me, even though I theoretically understand all this stuff, it is sometimes uncomfortable to watch the video. Obviously, now I've gotten used to it, but the question here is, why does it make you feel uncomfortable? Okay. Now, what challenges do you think they will face in the future? And what are these challenges rooted in? Right. So like what specifically with Nico and Miko, right? What challenges do you think they'll face when they grow older? And more importantly, why will they face those challenges, right? So the challenge is going to be quite simple, right? There will be times where a society, if they go outside of their, essentially their neighborhood or their city, if they look for work, they go to school, they do whatever. The rest of society is not gender neutral, right? The rest of society is gender conforming, or at least, their dominant society, right? So the challenges they're going to face are things like finding a job. Maybe they'll maybe they'll face a little challenge in college or whatever, wherever they go, just in terms of being different from the rest of the people, like being bullied. Maybe they look for a job, like they might ask like, are you a woman or a man, male, female, whatever, right? So ultimately, what are these challenges rooted in? We're going to kind of circle back to this, right? But like, what does it all come from? That's my main question. And the last thing is this wrong? So we're going to think about this real quick and come back to it at the end. Okay. Now, let's watch Judith Butler. So before I start this video, Judith Butler is she's not an anthropologist, first of all. But more importantly, I see what I did wrong here. I didn't show this down. So more importantly, though, she is a there we go. She is a philosopher, and yeah, sorry, I think they're they now. They were a big part of developing gender studies. But again, I want to emphasize again that Judith Butler is not an anthropologist, and we'll talk about that, why that's important in a second. Okay, so we're gonna play this video. I'm gonna mute myself.
It's one thing to say that gender is performed, and that's a little different from saying gender is performative. When we say gender is performed, we usually mean that we've taken on a role, we're acting in some way, and that our acting or our role playing is crucial to the gender that we are and the gender that we present to the world. To say that gender is performative is a little different, because for something to be performative means that it produces a series of effects. We act and walk and speak and talk in ways that consolidate an impression of being a man or being a woman. I was walking down the street in Berkeley when I first arrived several years ago, and a young woman who was, I think, in high school leaned out of her window and she yelled, "Are you a lesbian?" And she was looking to harass me. Or maybe she was just freaked out, or she thought I looked like I probably was one and wanted to know. But instead I just turned around and I said, "Yes, I am." And that really shocked her. We act as if that being of a man or that being of a woman is actually an internal reality, or something that's simply true about us, a fact about us. Actually, it's a phenomenon that's being produced all the time and reproduced all the time. So to say gender is performative is to say that nobody really is a gender from the start. I know it's controversial, but that's my claim. Think about how difficult it is for sissy boys, or how difficult it is for tomboys to function socially without being bullied, or without being teased, or without sometimes suffering threats of violence. Or without their parents intervening to say, maybe you need a psychiatrist, or why can't you be normal? So, there are institutional powers like psychiatric normalization, and there are informal kinds of practices like bullying, which try to keep us in our gendered place. There's a real question for me about how such gender norms get established and policed, and what the best way is to disrupt them and to overcome the police function. It's my view that gender is culturally formed, but it's also a domain of agency or freedom. It's most important to resist the violence that is imposed by ideal gender norms, especially against those who are gender different, who are non-conforming in their gender presentation.
So there's a few interesting things there. I know it's a little deep, but it's fine. So there's a couple things, right? Actually, let's talk about this one first. she had two essential points, right? One thing is that gender is cultural, right? When she talks about the words performative, that's what she's really referring to. However, her description has a little bit more specificity to it. The reason why performative is important is because when you think of the word performed, you think of something that's intentional, but a lot of the things we do with with gender is not intentional, right? So, for example, if I were to say you were to perform singing on a stage, you would think about performing singing and actually producing the voice and the sounds or whatever and the expressions that you want with your singing, right? But with Judith Butler, right, when she talks about gender being performative and why it's not performing is because a lot of times, most of the time, when we are doing gender things, we are not thinking about it consciously. We are doing it kind of like in a very unintentional way. And that's what performative is in her case, right? So, for example, if I'm getting dressed in the morning, I'm not saying I want to look like a boy or a man. I'm saying I want to look good, right? However, what is good for me is obviously gender separated from what would be good for someone that is of the opposite gender. And so in that way, I am still whatever you want to call it, reproducing, reinforcing gender norms. But perhaps more importantly, it is not being done consciously, right? You're not like purposely like, oh, I want to look like a man, or I want to look like a girl. Like that's not necessarily what we think of, right? When I use the bathroom, I don't think, oh, I need to use, go to the men's room. I'm thinking like I need to freaking, take a pee right now, right? So, it's that's kind of important, okay? But also, her notion that gender is cultural or is performative. Sorry, her understanding. The reason why I say it's important that she's not an anthropologist is because even her proposition that like it's controversial that we're not born a certain gender, that is not controversial. That's actually a fact, right? Not because we do not have different biology, but more importantly because we are taught to be men and women depending on our cultural backgrounds, right? So that's a kind of like clear indicator that Judith Butler is not an anthropologist. Now, that being said, though, right, what is very interesting is what she says, her quote about repeated acts and having that sort of being. Now let's go back to this one. So the key point here, right? This is a pretty long sentence, and we're gonna break this down line by line. If you are not watching this lecture, it's going to be pretty tough for you. So Judith Butler argues that gender is something people accomplish through a set of repeated acts within a highly rigid regulatory frame that congeals over time to produce the appearance of substance of a natural sort of being. That sounds very complicated, but it's actually pretty simple. So Judith Butler argues that gender is something people accomplish. So gender is something people do by doing things, but through a set of repeated acts, just doing things over and over again within a highly rigid regulatory frame. So in this particular case, what Judith Butler is referring to is society. Okay. Now, why is society a highly rigid regulatory frame? It is because if you fall out of the normal borders, if you will be told to fall back into the borders, right? Now, some of that telling is very direct, but some of that telling also happens in indirect ways. Some of the easier things to understand with gender is, for example, I see it all the time in like when I work at elementary schools, it's like, a boy takes out like a pink folder and then all of the rest of the kids say, oh, are you a girl or are you gay? Like all this other stuff. That is a form of regulation, right? So when you fall out of bounds, it will push you, or there are some types of forces, whether they're direct or indirect, that will push you back to go in the middle again. Okay. Now, in that case, that is society, because whenever we act outside of our gender, whatever assumptions or gender norms, there will be a force that will try to push us back. Whether we listen is a different story, but there is a force that tells us not to go that direction. Okay. Now, congeals over time to produce a sort appearance of substance of a natural sort of being. If you guys have ever made I don't know, any kind of meat dish, right? We put in the fridge, how the fat goes from like oily to like solid white, right? Or when you do you like Jello mix and you mix it in and then you put it in the fridge and afterwards like solid, That is the process of congealing. So what this is saying, what this last part is saying, is that it comes together to appear like it is of substance, of a natural sort of being, but in reality it's cultural. So I'm gonna say the whole thing again with the new definition. So Judith Butler argues that gender is something people do by doing certain things over and over again, okay, within society that comes together over time to make it seem like it's natural, but in reality it's cultural. Okay. So there's a okay. Head sneeze. There we go. Okay, so what she's referring to specifically, right, is that we do things, we do gendered things all the time, right? We do them so much though that we assume that they're biological, but in fact they are actually cultural, right? So let me give you a crazy example that will make things seem like more sense. Bob grew up, and his family believed that every man should own a truck, right? So as Bob was growing up, he had a bunch of toy trucks. He grew up, and every day his dad taught him about having, whatever, the Ford F-150, something like that. That's the only truck I can think. So let's just say that. And so when Bob grows up, he gets a Ford F-150. He's a man, right, in his thoughts. Bob goes to college and he sees me, and I'm driving a Toyota Corolla. Okay. And he's like, Professor Fong, you're not a man. You're not driving a truck. Okay. Now, while I am not fitting into his gender norm, right? Does that change my identification as being a man? No, because I'm still saying I'm a man, and what he defines as man is different from what I define as man, right? But more importantly, it is because in his upbringing, right, he was taught over and over again, right, by his family and whatever, his repeated acts, okay, in society, that trucks are associated with being a man. And so, obviously, people who don't have trucks are not men. Okay, now I know this example is a little more exaggerated, but again, the main point is that it is through the repetition that like it happens over and over again that makes it seem like it's natural, right? And he, what's it called? Bob, in this case, believes that all men naturally should like trucks, which is not the case. Okay. Now, another good example I have was actually in my real life. I was teaching this kid, I think he was like in first grade or something, and all the women in his life had long hair, right? Now, what was funny was that he believed that women were born with long hair. They didn't grow, they were born with long hair. And why is that? It's because he's seen women with long hair all the time. So as you can see, that gender norm, which is women having long hair, is seen over and over again. So much so that this little kid assumed that all women were born with long hair, but in reality, they grow their hair just like anyone else, right? But again, the main point is that this is a cultural assumption, right? We are assuming that culturally, in Bob's case, that all men like trucks, and in my other young students' case, that all women have long hair. Right? We are assuming that that is natural of being a man or of a woman, but in reality, it is just a cultural thing, right? Women grow their hair longer because it is culturally more acceptable. Does that make sense? Okay. So now you might be asking, why is that kind of important? Oh, actually, sorry. I'm going to elaborate a little bit more. But what it comes down to is basically it helps us break down how we not only establish gender, which in this case is our main focus, but more importantly, helps us understand how our cultural assumptions and how truth is established in our mind in general. Okay. Now, I've took this part out from reading. Don't worry about the reading, but the name is I think it's Dude, You're a Fag, Making Masculinity in American High School, right? This person was an ethnographer. She was a sociologist. Anyway, she just studied high schools. But this was kind of like her main point. The notion that masculinity or sexuality slash gender in general is not a set definition. Many definitions, perhaps similar but never truly defined. These gender roles are fed by day-to-day environments, such as school-related activities, right? She concludes by suggesting that close attention to sexuality highlights masculinity as a process rather than social identity associated with specific bodies. So basically what she's trying to say, which is kind of using the same vein of Judith Butler stuff, is that, masculinity and femininity, all these, and even sexuality is, at least in her ethnography and her research, is like heavily defined in high school, right? And the students in her stories are trying to find where they exist, where the boundaries of what it is to be a man, the boundary of what it is to be a woman, like where they exist, right? And so you'll notice then that everyone has a different understanding of what it is to be a man and what it is to be a woman. There are certain things that overlap for sure, but they are going to be different, for all the high school students that she was studying. But now let's translate this into a larger picture, right? What it is to be a man and woman are very different depending on which culture you go to, right? Certain things are thought of as manly in certain cultures, and certain things are thought of as feminine in other cultures, right? It is dependent on your cultural background, right? And basically, what this last one is saying, right, is that when you think about, well, in her case, sexuality, but also gender, right? When you think about what it means to become a man, what it means to become a woman, it's associated more with social identity than it is associated with your physical attributes, right? Like, what do you need to do as a man? What do you need to know how to do as a man? How do you act? How do you talk? How do you dress? These are all things that are more important in understanding masculinity and femininity. Okay. Now, so how does the gender neutral video relate back to culture? How does this reflect on things like multiculturalism being said in different cultures? So, again, I'm not going to lie to you. I show you this video, and I know that a lot of students don't love this video, but number one, I don't really care. Number two, more importantly, people get so wrapped up with this concept of being gender neutral that they actually miss the point of what I'm trying to convey to you, right? Which is, how is gender created? Okay. How is gender created? It is, according to Judith Butler, which we just went over, it is through the repeated acts, right? Doing things over and over again, and eventually they seem natural, but in reality they are cultural, right? Now, what's very interesting about this, though, is that the way that Mapa and Mama remove gender, and I put those in quotes, we'll talk about that in a second, remove gender from their day-to-day lives is very interesting, right? The way like when they read to the kids mama and mapa, the way they dress their kids, these are very obvious, things that they've done, right? What's very interesting though is I wonder how it is going to really end up, because the schools can say what they want. It's and the Vice documentary, remember it's a documentary, it's not an ethnography, so it's going to be a little biased, obviously, right? They can say what they want, but it is not easy to remove gender from the classroom. Why is it not easy to remove gender from the classroom? Because literally we've all been taught from the same gender origin point, right? We've all been taught this understanding of what it is to be a man or woman, so on and so forth. And other parents might have different opinions, and those parents might believe more in gender conformity, whatever, right? That's what makes it difficult. So, but anyway, circling back, right? So what I want you to pay attention to is the connection between gender neutral Mapa and Mama, how they created gender neutrality for their for the kids, right? Is through the repeated acts. So what type of repeated acts are we talking about specifically? In the storybooks, they read back, mama, mapa. In the what's it called? In the schools, they have the toys without gender, right? But to be fair, though, a lot of schools now have that. Also, the schools try to focus a little less on kind of associating gender with stuff and kind of doing like the opposite. Not maybe not the opposite, but exploring more, like, for example, like dinosaur things than gender things, if that makes sense. That's also a strategy, right? That's kind of how they're creating these repeated acts for their kids, right? Now, if you look at us, like which I would assume most of us grew up in a gender conforming family, right, where there's like men and women. If you look at us, right, we are doing so many gendered things we don't even like notice it. And that goes back again to Judith Butler's understanding of what it means to be performative, right? Now, performative is really important because again, you're not thinking of it actively. I'm not thinking, hey, I want to look like a man, so let me cut my hair short. No, not usually. Right? I'm thinking like, hey, I want to look good. This is a clean look. I'm gonna grow my hair out this way. You are not thinking I want to be more like a woman, so let me, wear this certain type of dress. No, you say, oh, I look good, and you go on with your day, right? Again, you're not. A lot of times you're not thinking about, oh, hey, I'm a man or a woman. Let me join this basketball team or join that basketball team, right? It really depends on what you're doing. But we do so many things that are based on gender. It's crazy, right? Our day-to-day lives are filled with it every day. When you go to Target, the blue and pink sections, right? It's pretty obvious. Even when you go to the like the hygiene sections, right? You think those freaking what are the women's razor blades are that much different from the men's razor blades? They're like freaking the same thing, okay? But anyways, the main point is we do so many gender things day to day. It is hard for us to separate what it is that is constructed by our society and what it is that is natural. Okay. So gender is culture, and that's why social culture anthropologists find the topic so interesting. This is very obvious, right? Almost everything we do as a man or a woman is it is cultural. Okay. So gender is cultural. Thus, studying how gender is formed is also studying how culture is formed. Remember, gender is created through repeated acts. So what does that mean for the video? Okay, now this is very important. So when we are talking about repeated acts, right, for specifically um, mapa and mama, right, it is the removing of gendered words from the storybooks, and it is also the toys that they use and the schools they sign them up to, right? So gender, just like everything else cultural, is scaffolding, right? There are intentional, unintentional regulations that are created through these scaffoldings. Remember what the other researcher said, more boys commit suicide, boys doing poorly in school. And then what the other woman was talking about being like having the what's it called, the Venn diagram of cool, strong, pretty, and helpful. Now, so I want to say one thing about these things though, right? Because they both sound good and they are all good, right? But a lot of times these people are looking at the results, right? Maybe it is more boys committing suicide and doing poorly in school because they are being treated like boys. Maybe if they were treated like girls, they'd be doing different things, right? They wouldn't have these issues. Now, the reason why I bring this up though, right, is because a lot of time, this is going to be very important. In Mapa and Mama are not removing gender from their life. What they're doing is they're changing gender. Very important. They are not removing gender from their life. They are changing gender. They're just creating different gender standards. Does that make sense? Please, if you're listening to this freaking video, this is essential. They are not removing gender. They are simply changing the gender standards. Okay? Because usually people who watch this, maybe yourself included, get very emotionally charged when you watch this video. You're not realizing that actually Mapa and Mama are just creating different gender standards for themselves. That's all they're doing, right? So, for example, right, like, it is very obvious that Mika wants to be more like Mappa, right? So it is not necessarily that Mika and Nico are understanding what gender actually is. It is more that they are relying on their previous understanding or their understanding of gender as it is right now and just copying it more or less, right? Because as kids, what we're doing is we are learning the culture around us, which is again connecting back to the old stuff. Okay. Now, this is very important though. If you treat a gender, let's say a kid, a certain way because they're a boy, they're going to grow and then you're going to keep treating them like a boy and then keep on going the boy direction. If you treat a kid like a girl, they're probably going to go in the girl direction, and treat them like a girl, they're going to go in that direction, right? Now, does it exactly go that way? No. But the main point I want to point out though is that scaffolding is very important here. You are building an understanding of gender from a young age, right? So now let's scroll back to scroll. Let's move towards Mapa's understanding of gender. So I don't know if you remember from the beginning, who is Mapa? Mapa's name is Dell, and they were I think they were from the Midwest in America, right? In America, and they were intersex, and they basically faced a lot of you know, bullying and shame and whatever about their body, right? And Dell became a artist, I believe. Is it artist or scholar? I think it's an artist. I don't know, photography, yeah, artist. Talking about gender, or I mean, discussing gender. So let me ask you a crazy question. If Dell grew up in Thailand, where being intersex is less frowned upon, do you think that Dell would have the same upbringing and same understanding of culture? Sorry, same understanding of gender? No, they would not. Their back would be completely different. So now let me bring it to what we're talking about right now. Do you think that Mika and Nico's understanding of gender, do you think that it is from Sweden or do you think it's from America? That's a hard question, right? Because their understanding of gender largely comes from Dell and Mama, their partner, but they didn't really talk about her much. Okay. So when we talk about scaffolding, we really mean business. It is very important to understand that everything you know and you do is built off of things in the past. Okay. So in reality, there's no major difference between how gender is taught in this video versus how we learn gender in our own society. The only difference is the difference in values. They value gender neutrality and we value single gender conformity. That's it, right? And if you remember toward the end of the video where Mapa was like, you know, a lot of people criticize, you know, their lifestyle because they're raising their kids gender neutral and they're saying that the kids aren't even choosing, they're just trying to be like Mapa and stuff. What Mapa brought up was a good point, right? Like people raise children just like them. I need you to ask yourself, if you saw a dad hit a Barbie out of their son's hands and was like, yo, men don't do that, men don't play with dolls or whatever, would you have the same reaction as you did with this video? The answer is no, right? Because gender neutrality makes us feel much more uncomfortable than masculine, whatever you want to call it, right? Masculine gender norms. Does that make sense? So when we talk about he or she, like how are we really understanding this thing? It's through our environment. We see different things and it confirms it for us. What is a man? What is a woman, right? So you really have to ask yourself, again, what is it about this particular video that makes it so powerful or impactful for you, right? A lot of students have told me crazy things like, oh, you know, like, I don't know, people said it's crazy things like, you know, Jesus, you know, had Adam and Eve and all that stuff. I'm like, great, you know, but when you start bringing religion to the thing, that means, you know, it's not valid because it doesn't really explain what needs to be going on in society. Okay. When people talk about oh, it's a cult, well, you know, again, what's the difference between the way that they are teaching gender versus the way we teach gender? The only difference, the real difference only, is that our understanding of gender is confirmed and recreated in our society much easier, right? So for example, if I were looking for books with genders, it'd be a lot easier for me to find those books than it would be for Mapa to find books with gender neutral pronouns. That's like pretty much the only difference. Okay. So again, in reality, there is no difference between the way that gender is taught in this video versus how we learn gender. Okay. And I know that might be a very shocking thing for you, but it's not. It's really not. If you really break down and just remove yourself, you know, remove your own beliefs from the situation. That's what I want you to take away from this video. Is I want you to ask yourself, what is the real difference between the way they are raising their kids and the way they are teaching gender to their kids and the way we learn gender? And I want you to ask yourself, is there a real difference? And quite frankly, the answer is no. Okay. Now, just a quick note, you know, ethnography. As an ethnography, this is trash. I want to let you know, okay? Because like when you ask that question, like, hey, do you want to be called he, she, or hen today? You are throwing the whole thing into a loop, into like you're purposefully stirring the pot. The whole point is for us to analyze and understand the behavior and the thought process of these people. But when you ask questions like that, you're automatically just like you're stirring the pot immediately, which is great for journalism and like clicks and stuff. But for ethnography, it's not the best, right? Not to mention, judging by initial appearances, how do you think this video will skew, right? This is from Vice News. Vice News is not known for being a conservative news outlet, right? Unfortunately, they fell apart, though. I wish they were still around. It doesn't matter. Main point is already just by knowing that it's from Vice, you kind of already know it's going to skew towards one opinion versus the other. So you really need to ask yourself, like, how does that affect the story? You know? All right, so some overall takeaways. It's important to remember that culture is not just the superficial stuff we hear about in articles. It is much deeper and more ingrained in our lives. In this case, it is gender, but you take a step back, this is how all of our culture is formed, right? When you think about Latino or Hispanic, what do you think about? I'm assuming if you're in New York, you're usually thinking about Puerto Rican, Dominican. If you're in Southern California, you're probably thinking about Mexican. If you're in Florida or what's called Miami, you're probably thinking about Cuban, right? It is a similar thing for ethnicity, nationality, and race than it is for gender. It happens so often that we associate it with the truth. We associate it with biology. But in reality, it has nothing to do with biology. It is culturally formed. Now, it is not to say that that culturally formed is more real or less fake or whatever, but it is important to understand that this is the way that truth is formed in our minds. Okay. So when people say they're accepting of diversity, what do they really mean? Are they actually accepting cultural differences, or do they just have a different set of culture values they are willing to accept? To realistically be multicultural and accepting other cultures is a difficult task, and most people don't even know that they are being ethnocentric. So part of another reason why I showed you this video is because a lot of people love saying that they're diverse, that they're down with different cultures and whatever, but in reality, they're not, right? They might have a wider set of things that they're willing to accept, but it does not mean that they are truly down with different cultures. Because if you look at this video, this is a different cultural way of living. Are you down with this? A lot of people are not, right? And so you need to ask yourself, what types of things am I not down with and why? Why? And ask yourself, is that a valid reason or not a valid reason? Usually it's not a valid reason, okay? Now, again, this is not to say that you need to like, send your kids to a gender neutral school tomorrow, but you need to recognize that, hey, this person is living their life differently and that's how they're gonna live their lives. Great. But you cannot add that extra judgment there, right? Remember the example with the people in the train? I was raised to speak quietly on the train, and I see a bunch of loud kids on the train. Instead of just saying like, hey, those kids are raised differently and that's okay, I'm not gonna be loud. What I'm saying in my head is, oh, those people are uneducated, those people are obnoxious, those people are bullies, whatever. They're associating a judgment onto that doesn't really need to exist there, okay? So ethnocentrism in many ways is inevitable, right? So I'm not asking you not to be ethnocentric. However, it is important to realize that the differences that exist between people are culturally caused and oftentimes not a reflection of character or intention. So what I'm trying to say is I'm not asking you to know every culture in the world. I don't really give a fruit. I really don't care. But what I really want you to do is ask yourself, is this difference between these people, is it cultural or is it personal or intentional? Most of the time, it is cultural. Most of the freaking time, it is cultural. Okay? So that is kind of what I want you to take away from this lecture overall. All right? Great. So real quickly, just make sure I cover all the where is it? Yeah, all the things, right? So do you agree with the choices that Mappa has made with her family? I don't care. It doesn't matter to me whether you agree or not, right? Because again, the main point of this video is to show you how gender is created. Okay, that's the main point. It's the repetition of things happening over and over and over again that creates gender. And ultimately creates truth. Okay. Now, what challenge do you think they're facing in the future, and what are these rooted in? That is very obvious. Jobs, friends, maybe even dating, living in a single gender world. That's the challenge, right? But where does it come from? It comes from us valuing gender conformity or gender whatever, singular gender conformity, and them valuing gender neutrality. That's it. That's literally where all the problems have come from. You could give me all these million examples. I don't care. What it comes down to is that's what it's rooted in. Okay. And so finally, is this wrong? I would argue no. Is it right? No. Even better answer, is this wrong? I don't care. It doesn't matter because that is what they value. That is what they choose to do. If you believe in multiculturalism, if you believe in being diverse and accepting, being accepted different cultures, you need to be non-judgmental about this process. That's ultimately what it comes down to. Okay. All right. Well, I hope you guys found this lecture interesting. Don't forget that the reflection is due at the end of this week. The midterm will be due next week. I will still post lectures. That'll be just for, just so we don't fall behind. Actually, well, we'll see. If we're ahead, I won't post. I'll give you guys a week break, but if not, then I'll post. And then the quiz is also due at the end of this week. All right. As always, if you have any questions, just shoot me an email at raymond.fong@kvcc.cuny.edu.